Hey everybody! As you can tell, it's winter here in Iowa. It's pretty cold, but that's not going to stop us from working on the Corolla here. I've got a ton of things planned for it, but in today's video, we're going to be figuring out an issue that it's had ever since I got it a little over a year ago, which is when the engine is completely cold. For the first few minutes, it surges up and down between 2,000, 2,500 RPM, up and down. It's not so much of an issue in the operation. Once it warms up, it seems to run pretty good, but I'm almost certain it's the intake manifold gasket, and so we're going to work on replacing that in this video. And I've got the door open here just so that we don't have any fumes building up when I show you the issue. We're going to start it up and we're going to take a look, so let's jump in. And then we'll just wait a few seconds and then it'll start doing it, and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about here. Okay, it's doing it right now, and you can see as you watch the tachometer up and down, and then it'll clear up after a few minutes of idling, and so now it's pretty much cleared up and it should just start running. It's just going to keep running normally now. So let's hop out and take a look at what we need to do to fix this. When I first got the car, I did a bunch of tune-up type of things just to make sure it was running as good as I could, as easily as possible, such as cleaning the mass airflow sensor, cleaning the throttle plate. I had the fuel injectors professionally cleaned, as well as replacing the upstream oxygen sensor due to a slow response code. None of that changed the surging issue that I was having. So if you're having this issue, you can try those things first, but the most likely culprit is going to be the intake manifold gasket or the idle air control valve, which is what we're going to work on today. So let's jump on into the engine. Okay, so here's the engine, and here's the intake manifold gasket, the part that we're actually replacing. And that part is underneath here, where this plastic part, the intake manifold, connects to the block of the engine here. And so what we're going to have to do is take off some bolts. We've got, I think it's about 5 that are going into the block along here. Then there's a support bracket here. And then before we do that, we're also going to take this hose off and then take the throttle itself out. And in the book it says you have to take the fuel injection rail off. I'm not really sure if you have to do that or if you can just leave it on. So we're going to try leaving it on and then see how that goes. And then we're also going to clean up inside of here is where the idle air control valve is. So unfortunately, I was going to take the throttle cable off or the assembly that it was on so that when I get everything pulled apart, I could take the throttle out and show you guys. But as you can see here, what happened is I was going to take this nut off that's on the shaft, and it just completely sheared the shaft off since it was seized on with rust. And the reason I was doing that is because the cable is also corroded really badly, and I didn't want to break this plastic piece here. And so I figured I'd have a better chance with this nut and shaft, but then that broke too. And if you're just doing what we're talking about in this video, the intake manifold gasket and the idle air control valve, I would leave the throttle alone if it looks really rusty and bad like mine did. Pull it off to the side and do your cleaning over here if you want to, and just leave the throttle cable hooked up. Don't worry about it. But I knew that I needed to get this off anyways since I'm adding cruise control in the future, and that requires replacing this cable. So I had to do this, and now I got to fix it, but we'll figure something out. Anyways, let's just keep going with the teardown here. Here's what I'm fighting with right now. Down here there's these two. You can see I've undone one of them, but there are these two right here that go into the throttle. And so to pull it off, I was just struggling to get those off. You're going to want to have yourself a set of different types of hose pliers and long extension needle noses and such things like that to get that apart. But once we get that off, I think everything else will be very straightforward. Just a couple of bolts to take the rest off. So you can see here where these two pipes are. For some reason there's coolant going into the throttle body. And so where these two pipes are, I'm going to plug using a couple of these little plugs here. That's probably the hardest part of this whole job. So with all of these bolts out and nuts, 2 nuts on studs and then 3 bolts, don't forget the one down here. That one has to come out too since that goes into the block as well. And now there's just one hose back here that's still holding us up down in there. So I'm going to pull that one off and then this whole thing will be able to come out. A pair of these long remote hose clamp removers will come in handy down there. And right there is what we're replacing. Probably the most likely culprit for these issues is this guy here, which you can see here is the new one, which is this nice new flexible material. The old one is super duper hard, and you can also see that it's been completely compressed over time, so it's way thinner. And you know, it's definitely, this thing has been leaking. It's pretty obvious because of all the oil that's on the surface, as well as that corresponds to the oil over here. You can see that as people have been filling it up over the years with oil, as you spill oil, some goes down onto here, and that shows how poorly it's been sealing since there's oil all over the place. And you can see I made a little bit of a mess since I had to run to grab these. Definitely just get a pair of these little plugs on hand. I had no clue there'd be coolant running into the throttle body. That seems pretty odd to me, but that's how it's done. So anyways, now if you wanted to take the throttle off of here, the throttle body, all you got is these 2 here and then 1 right in here. Quick note on the idle air control valve. I misspoke when I said to take these out. Do not take those out. Take these 3 out using some high quality JIS screwdriver, and then this whole thing comes off as an assembly that you can clean inside. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the parts here before I put everything back together. First off, the most important, why we're here, I've got the intake manifold gasket, the new one put in there. You don't need any grease or anything. I figured as long as I'm in here, I might as well replace these gaskets as well for a couple bucks each for the throttle body connection to the intake manifold gasket, as well as this idle air control valve gasket, again real cheap. I cleaned this out real good. I even used an ultrasonic cleaner on it, which was probably overkill, but in general, just use something like a nylon bristle brush to get into these little crevices. And then also, it's good to have a brass bristle Dremel tool brush to clean these mating surfaces. You don't necessarily want to use steel because it can cut into these alloys to clean the surfaces like this. Got the throttle nice and clean inside. Got all those little passageways cleaned up. You want to make sure to do that. A general rule of thumb I have is if I encounter old, really corroded and rusty hardware, JIS or Phillips, I like to replace it. So I'm going to go ahead and switch out these bolts that hold the idle air control valve on with some Allen heads. Figured that's a smart move. And I was able to fix where I broke this as well. It was a real pain, but I was able to tap it so that now right here was what I ended up deciding to use, what my local hardware store had. So that's going to be able to hold that plastic throttle cable thing on. And then over here we're putting in a new PCV valve, since I figure, hey, we're under here, why not? Then over here on the car, there's where the PCV valve goes, real easy to get to up there. I cleaned these surfaces up as best as I could, just using that brass bristle brush again and some brake clean, stuff like that. Now the only thing you're going to need to worry about when you're torquing down the new intake manifold is just start at the center and go outwards in a few progressive steps before you get to the full torque. So start and then get them finger tight, then tighten them a little more, then tighten them a little more, then tighten them all the way. You don't want to warp the plastic. You want to make sure it's nice and flat on there. And the torque spec is going to be 22 foot-pounds for getting those bolts and nuts on that hold that on. But that's pretty much everything, and if you can see, there's that rainbow effect coming from this mosaic thing we have stuck on the garage door. If you want to do this, you know, it's not too bad, and I'm not going to film putting it back together. Pretty much, it's just going to be like the reverse of what we just saw taking it apart. I've got almost everything back together here. Went on real smooth. The only real sticklers were there's a hose way down in there that's just, there's the two coolant lines, and then there's one that's just a little bit farther left that you'll have a tough time getting in. But once you have that in, you can push it all the way on. You won't have any issues. Don't forget these little brackets in here that hold the harness that go on the studs. And also don't forget this guy down here. Now I'll show you how this works here. You can see where I tapped that because it broke. And now I can just take this and thread this on here, screw this down, and then once it's all the way down, it'll hold this thing on. Not going to have any problems with that. Well, that's it for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed. It was real simple, as you could see. Nothing hard at all here. In the middle of doing this video, I also did the clutch and flywheel as well as the shift cable bushings, which links to those videos in the description below, and that was seriously hard stuff. This, on the other hand, honestly, I'd recommend this to anyone. Very simple tools. You'll just need a couple of deep sockets, and that's about it. This car seems to be running a little better now, but I can't say anything too for sure since I've had the battery disconnected and the computer still has to relearn everything. You know how it is with modern cars. But overall, it seems to run a little bit better. Haven't had the surging issue again, even after parking outside overnight. And so I'd call it a success. If you do this yourself and you still have issues, you might need to replace your idle air control valve if it's super worn out. I mean, you do get a lot of miles out of these Toyotas, so things will break eventually. But anyways, go check out my channel. Leave a comment down below. I want to hear what you think. Leave a like. I'd really appreciate it. And I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.